Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. This bill won't apply in Scotland, and I couldn't give it my wholehearted support if it did, because I share some of the reservations already expressed in this debate, particularly those expressed by my honourable friend, the member for Glasgow North West. However, I want to be clear that, as my honourable friend also acknowledged, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that there are problems with freedom of speech in our universities. In 2018, the Joint Committee on Human Rights, of which I'm proud to be Deputy Chair, published a report into freedom of expression in universities in which we found that there were issues and we recommended some reforms. We heard evidence about a number of problems, including attempts by students to no platform leading feminists and LGBT activists with a lengthy pedigree in campaigning for LGBT rights simply because they had engaged in critical debate about issues around feminism and trans politics. We also took evidence from student unions who argued that it's necessary to limit speakers who, as they put it, cause harm through speech. We were concerned on the JCHR that such an approach is detrimental to free speech and could prevent certain debates and viewpoints being heard. So we were very careful to emphasise that the right to free speech includes the right to say things which, although lawful, others might find offensive. Sadly, Mr Deputy Speaker, since 2018, the treatment of leading feminists and lesbian activists engaged in critical debate about issues around feminism and trans politics has worsened, both at the hands of student unions and at university authorities. Others have spoken about the attack on Julie Bindel, a well-known feminist activist who was attacked outside an event at Edinburgh University after she'd spoken about male violence towards women. Attendance at that event effectively ended the careers of two of the Scottish Parliament's most outstanding MSPs and my friends Joan McAlpine and Andy Whiteman. At the same time, Henderson, the well-respected Labour activist who was rector of the university, feared for her own safety on campus after students repeatedly falsely accused her of transphobia. The university failed to take appropriate action to deal with the hostility directed against her. And Mr Deputy Speaker, this is not an isolated incident. Another well-respected feminist academic at Edinburgh University, my friend Shereen Benjamin, has faced considerable problems. Both Shereen and Anne are Labour activists. Their comrades should defend them. I've spoken before in this chamber about the abuse, threats of violence and deplatforming directed against Professors Selina Todd, Kathleen Stock and Rosa Friedman at universities across England. Others have mentioned a report into similar events at Essex University, which was recently published and which identified that part of the problem is that universities are not correctly applying the law under the Education Act. Now, the chair of the Joint Committee on Human Rights, my right honourable friend, the member for Camberwell and Peckham, raised this with the Secretary of State when she wrote to him about the bill. And in fairness to him, he did take the trouble to deal with her detailed concerns about the bill, and copies of both her letter and his can be read on the JCHR website. But what was really important, as I said, about the University of Essex report into the cancellation of one speaking event and the decision to rescind an invitation to another was that both these events concerned gender-critical feminists. And the report found that their decisions the university's decisions were unlawful and recommended that apologies be made, and highlighted that the university appeared to misunderstand and misrepresent equality laws to the extent that the impression had been given to members of the university that gender-critical academics seeking to exercise their right to free speech could be excluded from the institution. Thanks to the Employment Appeal Tribunal's important decision on discrimination law in the case of Forstater against CGD Europe, we now know that gender-critical beliefs are protected under the Equality Act. So I think it's really the Equality Act that universities need to look at more than anything else to solve this problem. Because the Equality Act, Mr Deputy Speaker, is frequently being misconstrued or ignored in universities, and I'm afraid to say it's a symptom of a wider malaise. To quote the best-selling author and founder of the positive birth movement, Millie Hill, Those who are being dragged to the pyre are in most cases lifelong, left-leaning, open-minded, educated, tolerant women, often with a history of supporting minority groups. The efforts to silence us extend to violence and threats of violence, which many in position of power are too afraid to condemn. There's not much point in pious words about standing up against the abuse of women, then doing nothing when that abuse is going on right under your nose. But university authorities often look the other way, or worse still, participate in the witch hunts against lifelong feminists who simply want to make sure that women's voices and women's concerns are heard in important debates. This bill might not be the best way to deal with these problems as they are representing themselves in the university sector. The bill is flawed, but at least the bill acknowledges that there is a problem. And those who say there is not a problem are simply ostriches with their head in the sand. Thank you.
Marco Longhi.